So the story of how I discovered Legend of the Five Rings is kind of a weird one. So a couple of years ago, I had written my second book, Golden Steel, which is a historical fiction story set in feudal Japan. I had asked one of my coworkers to look it over before I decided to try and have it printed and published, and she said that she liked it. Then, last summer, she walked up and offered me a bunch of books from a franchise that her son used to be into, and she thought that I might like it. It was the complete series of Legend of the Five Rings, The Clan Wars. So I read the novels, decided that I liked them, did some research, and discovered a new lore to obsess over, even though I'd never once even heard of or even touched the card game. So yeah, thanks Nancy. This video literally wouldn't exist without you. This is going to be something of an experiment for me. For the next couple of weeks, in between my Should This Be Canon Star Wars videos, I'm going to cover the lore of Legend of the Five Rings instead of my usual 40k lore videos. Depending on how well received these videos are, I might do more on this particular lore. It's genuinely fascinating, and if I'm understanding things correctly, a lot of the storyline was actually determined by matches between players of the card game back in the day, which is pretty darn fascinating to me. So then, the story of Legend of the Five Rings begins quite literally with nothing. There was this thing called Nothing, or later, the Lying Darkness, and essentially it was what predated the universe. What's more, the Nothing actually created the universe, partly because it was afraid of being alone, and partly because it desired companionship. The big problem was that once it had created the world, the Nothing decided that it regretted creating the world and spoiling the perfect emptiness of the void. And from that point forward, it would dedicate itself wholly to its destruction. Unfortunately for the Nothing, once this particular genie had been released from the bottle, it was going to be extremely hard to put it back. For the universe, once created, began to develop and evolve. First, the lighter matter of the universe rose up to become the heavens, while the heavier, darker matter descended and became not so much the earth, not just yet. It was then mostly a sea of roiling, undefinable chaos. It didn't really become Earth until the coming of the first gods. The first of these were a trio known simply as the three gods whose names cannot be spoken. But they weren't here to give form to the world. No, it seems that their entire purpose for being was to create those that would. And so they created Onotangu, the moon, and Amaterasu, the sun, losing their names and identities in the process, which is why they effectively disappeared and are never mentioned again in Rokugani mythology. This actually lines up pretty well with the actual Shinto creation myth. Apparently, according to Shintoism, the beginning of the world was just a bunch of gods with very extravagant names appearing, not doing anything, and then disappearing. Things only really start happening with the appearance of the two creator gods. In Shintoism, the married pair Izanagi and Izanami. With their creators having departed, Lord Moon and Lady Sun went around and around the world, much like the celestial bodies they symbolized, naming things and giving them shape. Thus was made the oceans and the rivers, the mountains and the valleys, the forests and the deserts, trees and flowers, birds and beasts, and finally, the sentient races, the serpentine naga, the rat-like Nezumi, and many others, including a certain hairless ape named Man. Only the Nothing was unnamed by the two deities, and it managed to avoid this by hiding in the shadow of the moon and sun so as not to be noticed by either of them. At last, after constantly chasing one another across the sky, the Lord Moon finally caught up to the Lady Sun
and got busy!
Which resulted in the birth of 10 children. 8 sons, Ryoshin, Hantei, Akodo, Hida, Togashi, Bayushi, Shiba, and Fuleng, and 2 daughters, Shinjo and Doji. Evidently, Lady Sun was something of a doting mother, as she practically forgot about her husband after this point and focused all of her attention on her children. This, of course, made Lord Moon jealous and resentful of his children, and gave the Nothing an opportunity. Known from this point onward as the Lying Darkness, it convinced Lord Moon that his children would one day usurp him, And from this point forward, the creation myth of Legend of the Five Rings takes a hard right turn away from Shintoism and dives deeply into ancient Greek. Convinced by the lying darkness that his own offspring were a threat to him, Lord Moon decided to take a page from the Titan Kronos' book on what to do with potential usurper heirs. He ate them. Well, he swallowed them anyway, because apparently when evil gods decide to consume their offspring, they never think to chew their food. He succeeded in consuming 9 out of 10, but fortunately for Hantei, the youngest of the 10, his mother knew her Greek mythology as well as Lord Moon did, and she succeeded in making Lord Moon so drunk that she convinced him to swallow a stone and think it was his 10th child instead. The deception complete, Hantei was spirited away by his mother and spent his formative years living in hiding. During this time, Hantei taught himself how to fight and use a sword, while his mother taught him such things as virtue and honor so that he would one day become a good man like his father used to be. At last, Hantei thought himself powerful enough to challenge his father, and according to legend, their duel shook the very foundations of the heavens. Descriptions of the battle are vague, but there are only 2 things about it that are important. The first was that Hantei dodged a blow from his father's sword that opened a hole in the heavens, leading down to the mortal realms below. The second was that Hantei managed to cut open his father's stomach, freeing his siblings, or at least most of them. His brother Ryoshun had been the first to be eaten by Lord Moon, and as he had been in his stomach longer than the others, by the time Hantei cut open Lord Moon's stomach, Ryoshun had already died. His soul eventually wound up in Meido, the realm of the dead, where the spirits of the departed are judged for their actions in life. Despite having inflicted such a grievous injury upon Lord Moon, Hantei realized that he was no match for his father's power. Seeking to escape, he and his siblings leapt through the hole in the sky created by Lord Moon's sword. Wounded and furious, Lord Moon attempted to stop his children from fleeing his wrath and managed to grab both Hantei and his brother Fu Lang. Fortunately, Hantei's sword arm was free, and he managed to sever Lord Moon's hand, thus freeing him and Fu Lang to fall through the hole in the sky with the others. For some reason, Fu Lang was separated from his siblings during their fall from heaven. Not only did he land much farther to the south than the others, but his impact was much harder. Far to the south were the lands of Nezumi, a race of rat-like sapients, who had by this point established a flourishing empire. Fu Lang not only landed in the midst of their capital city, but he did so with the impact of an asteroid, hitting the ground so hard that he literally smashed not only through the Earth's surface, but through the mortal realm itself all the way down into Jigoku, the realm of hell. This brought about the end of the Nezumi civilization and created a breach through which the corrupting influence of Jigoku and its demonic inhabitants could leak outwards into the mortal realm, creating a corrupted wasteland known ever after as the Shadowlands. Meanwhile, the remaining 8 kami had landed far more gently and sedately in the lands inhabited by humans. The 8 kami discovered that having left heaven and entered the realm of mortals, they were no longer divine beings. They still had great power and wisdom, greater than that of any mortal human, but they were no longer immortal. They were no longer holy. Like the humans they saw around them, they could be slain, and eventually would grow old and die. As for the humans themselves, some fled in fear, while others stared in awe at these literal gods fallen from the heavens. The kami decided that they could do worse for their first move on Earth than to wander the lands and get to know the people they now found themselves amongst. They spent a couple of years doing this before finally returning to the hill upon which they'd first landed, where they came to the conclusion that humans were ultimately good, but in need of guidance. And so the former gods agreed that this could be achieved if they took charge of matters and ruled over humanity. But this raised a question: which among them was going to be in charge? Ultimately, they chose to settle matters with a tournament. The winner would be the new ruler, the new emperor, of the land of Rokugan. There aren't really that many details about the tournament of the kami, and what little there is mostly applies to the individual kami that participated, and I'll have to go over those when I talk about each of their respective clans. But the long and the short of it was that ultimately Hantei came out the victor. and his siblings acknowledged him as the first emperor of the Emerald Empire. Because, in case you hadn't noticed by now, the setting of Legend of the Five Rings is essentially Dungeons and Dragons if it were set in feudal Japan instead of medieval Europe. This is a land of samurai, imperial courtiers, Taoist magicians, and ninjas. And while Hantei set himself up as Hantei I, emperor of all of this, his 7 siblings went out into the world, gathering followers, marrying spouses from among the mortal population, and eventually establishing the 7 great clans, each taking an animal as their symbol or clan crest. Okoto, greatest warrior of his siblings, founded the Lion Clan. Hida, physically the tallest and strongest, founded the Crab Clan. Bayushi the Cunning founded the Scorpion. Graceful Doji the Crane. Curious Shinjo the Kirin Clan. While Shiba formed a partnership with a powerful mortal sorcerer named Isawa and founded the Phoenix Clan. Even Togashi, the loner among his siblings, who never intended to find followers or a clan of his own, ended up creating the Dragon Clan. While his siblings were all off wandering the land, gathering retainers and claiming territory for themselves, Hantei chose to remain and establish his imperial seat of power on Seppun Hill, the spot where he had first fallen to earth and where he had just won the right to rule all of Rokugan. Hantei's new subjects built the imperial palace over the course of nearly 2 decades. By the time they were finished, a great city had already built up around the palace, one which Hantei chose to name Otosan Uchi, literally father's home, symbolizing his place as father of the empire. It was during these early years that, just like his siblings, Hantei also gathered to him his own retainers and close followers. First among these was the tribe of Seppun, named for the priestess who was their leader. Lady Seppun and her husband Akagi are said to have been the first humans to witness the fall of the 8 kami to Earth. Lady Seppun herself approached Hantei and promised to swear fealty to him if he would aid her and her tribe against their enemies, the tribe of Noriaki. The 2 tribes had been at war with one another for years now, in a bloody and savage conflict that had cost the lives of Seppun's 2 eldest sons. Hantei agreed to the bargain, and though he was no longer immortal, his might surpassed that of any human. Lady Seppun and her tribe were therefore the first to swear themselves to Hantei's service, becoming known collectively as the Seppun family. Both the imperial household and the 7 great clans are comprised of several families, each with a specific role within that clan. The role of the Seppun family would be defined by the 2 surviving sons of Lady Seppun, Anzu and Kichi. As Hantei had fought for them and their family, they pledged that from this day forward, they, their sons, and their daughters would fight to defend Hantei and his heirs against all threats. While Hantei was building his palace, the 2 sons of Lady Seppun journeyed across all of Rokugan. Anzu studied the techniques of the greatest warriors of the land, while Kichi spoke with wise men, priests, and Shugenja magic users. Upon their return to Otosan Uchi, both brothers began to take disciples from among their former tribesmen to pass on what they had learned. Thus did the Seppun family firmly establish their role as protectors of the imperial household. The followers of Seppun Anzu became the Imperial Guard, peerless swordsmen trained to protect the emperor's person with their lives. The followers of Seppun Kichi became the Hidden Guard, skilled magic users dedicated to protecting the imperial household from all supernatural threats. But not every threat to the emperor can be defeated by a sword or a spell, and this leads us to the second of Hantei's followers, Otomo. Born the second son of an especially violent local tribal warlord, Otomo eventually succeeded to leadership of his tribe after both his father and elder brother got themselves killed in the endless fighting. Where they had been strong and brutal, Otomo had been small, wiry, and clever, preferring to outwit his enemies rather than outfight them. Being such a consummate opportunist, he saw the obvious advantages of aligning himself with the new kami rulers of Rokugan, and so pledged his loyalty to Hantei. Where the Seppun family established their own role within the imperial household very quickly, the Otomo family grew into its role over the course of a few generations. Eventually, they became the Emperor's chief political advisors and manipulators. While Legend of the Five Rings is a setting of samurai honor and combat, it's also a world of courtly politics and intrigue. Such a political environment inevitably breeds factions. The role of the Otomo family is to keep an eye on these factions and to constantly play them off against one another, so that they can never consolidate and pose a political threat to the Emperor, depriving him of his power. With his brand new capital and brand new followers, Emperor Hantei set for himself the task of producing an heir to his newfound dynasty, and for that, he needed a wife. It is said that Hantei scoured the whole of Rokugan for a bride, but no matter how many women were presented to him wherever he went, he found none that could stir his heart. Then one day, while traveling through the lands of the Crane clan, Hantei found himself separated from his entourage near the fishing village of Ikieto. As he stood upon the shore, he heard amongst the sound of the waves the haunting melody of a woman singing. The singing seemed to be coming from an island just off the shore, and so when Hantei returned to his entourage and told them of what he'd heard, his retainers demanded that someone take him to the island. One of the fishermen of Ikieto agreed to do so, but when they arrived at the island, Hantei could see no sign of anyone, woman or otherwise, and so returned in disappointment. What nobody else knew, however, was that where most of the fathers of Rokugan had happily presented their daughters for the possibility of becoming related to the Emperor, the fisherman was not so inclined, and had hidden his maiden daughter in a secret cave on the island. Miyoko, the daughter in question, was ignorant of what was going on, but she had spied upon her father and the strange, handsome young man he had brought to the island that day. Later, when she asked her father who the stranger had been, the fisherman lied, saying that he'd just been a beggar. Evidently, this did not deter Miyoko, as that night she took her pet dove, penned a haiku, and then tied it to its leg and sent it off, hoping to find the beggar. Apparently, this dove had an amazing memory and killer navigational skills, because that same night, while Hantei was wandering through the gardens of his new palace, he heard a disturbance and came upon an exhausted-looking dove tangled in one of the bushes. He freed the bird, read the poem attached to it, and was so floored by its beauty that he decided then and there that whoever had written this was the girl he would marry. When Hantei returned to Ikieto, the fisherman, still desperate to hide his daughter, tried to pass off one of the other village girls as the author of the poem. This scheme fell apart very quickly, however, as Hantei asked the girl in question to write another poem, and she proved to be illiterate. Now, none of the sources I've ever read describe whether or not Hantei threatened the fisherman to convince him to show him his true daughter, but honestly, given the vagaries of this, I wouldn't be that surprised if he had. Either way, the fisherman finally relented and took Hantei to the island once more to show him his daughter. Legend has it that when Hantei saw Miyoko for the first time, he was so struck by her beauty that the tears he shed in amazement turned into chips of jade. Because Miyoko and her family had been servants of the Crane clan, these relics, the so-called Jade Tears, were presented to the Crane clan as thanks, and have been in possession of the wife of the Doji family daimyo ever since. And at last we finally have a concrete date, as Miyoko and Emperor Hantei were wed in the year 26. That is, 26 years following the Kami's fall to Earth. The marriage was apparently loving and very fruitful, resulting in several children, though only 2 are named, the eldest son, Genji, and his younger brother, Yamato. Unfortunately, the good times were not to last. In year 33 of the Empire, reports began arriving from the Crab clan in the south. The reports claimed that the land was becoming increasingly tainted and corrupted, and demon sightings had increased markedly. Then, one day, when Hantei and all his siblings were holding court together at Otosan Uchi, an unexpected guest arrived. Fu Leng, the 9th Kami, the one that had fallen not to Earth, but into Hell. Unlike his siblings, Fu Leng had retained his immortality and most of his divine powers. If anything, the decades spent in the realm of Jigoku had made them stronger. But it was very clear to all that Fu Leng had grown corrupted and insane. And when he demanded the right to challenge Hantei for leadership of the Empire, after all, he had not been present at the tournament, The kami all refused, and so began the first great war in the history of the new empire of Rokugan. With this declaration of war, Hantei made two crucial decisions. First, realizing that the wall surrounding his capital would be no defense against the demonic monstrosities of the Shadowlands, he ordered the wall to be torn down and a new one built in its place. Thus began the construction of Miwaku Kabe, the enchanted wall, a barrier of magic as well as stone. During the construction, Shugenja worked alongside the laborers and stonemasons, weaving spells and defensive wards into the very fabric of the wall in order to safeguard it against any supernatural threat. His second decision was to decree that any non-human within the boundaries of the Empire was to be either exiled or destroyed to deny Fu Lang more allies. This decree also applied to anyone who was not willing to submit to the rule of the kami and their laws. Among those that chose to flee from Rokugan were the tribe of Noriaki, the ancient enemy of the Seppun family whom Hantei had helped defeat when he had first arrived. Eventually, the tribe of Noriaki went south into the Shadowlands, and its leader, Mutsuhito, became the first human to swear allegiance to Fu Lang. Fortunately for the kami, and especially the people constructing Miwaku Kabe, Fu Lang took a long time to gather his forces and launch his attack. There were demonic raids and acts of sabotage, supernatural and otherwise, but the first big push by Fu Lang and his armies didn't come until the year 42, and by then the enchanted wall had been completed. Hantei's imperial household and the armies of the 7 great clans manned the walls of the capital as armies of demons and ogres surrounded them. Because the Shadowlands army was able to attack the city from all sides, the fighting that followed became known as the Battle of 4 Winds. And while details are scarce, the ultimate result was a narrow victory for the Empire. Victory had been achieved, but at a grievously high cost, and Hantei wasn't sure that his defenses could withstand a second assault. It was then that a strange little man calling himself Shinsei came to the court of the Emperor of Rokugan. Hantei was initially dismissive of this raggedy old man, but started to take him a bit more seriously when Shinsei subdued most of his guards without breaking a sweat. The Emperor and the sage conversed throughout the night, Hantei mostly asking questions and Shinsei mostly providing answers. The conversation would be recorded by Hantei's brother Shiba, and this would form the basis of the Tao or Way of Shinsei, which in turn became the basis of Shinseism, one of the primary religions of the Emerald Empire. According to Shinsei, he had studied ancient prophecies left behind by elder races that had once inhabited Rokugan long before the coming of man, and that they suggested a way to beat Fu Lang once and for all. All he asked of the Emperor was 7 champions, one from each of the great clans founded by his siblings. They would go with him into the Shadowlands and defeat Fu Lang. Hantei, of course, immediately suggested his siblings. They were no longer immortal, nor as powerful as Fu Lang individually, but they were all still much more powerful than any ordinary human. But Shinsei rejected this idea. He insisted that the 7 champions, his 7 thunders as he called them, be mortal. It's hard to explain exactly why this had to be without it taking at least a full 10 minutes, so the best way I can summarize it is to borrow a page from Narnia and say that this is essentially part of the deep magic that underpins the world of Legend of the 5 Rings. Fu Lang and his demon armies fight for the side of evil, powered by corruption and the darkest magics. They seek to dominate and control the mortal realm. Meanwhile, the side of good believes that the mortals of Rokugan have the right to decide their own destiny, and so the side of good must be represented by mortal men and women, armed only with virtue, honor, and what skills they themselves possess. Reluctantly, Hantei accepted Shinsei's plan. He then turned to his 7 siblings, and they in turn selected their champions. Akodo of the Lion Clan chose Lady Matsu, his fiercest warrior. Togashi of the Dragon Clan chose Mirumoto, his swordmaster and personal bodyguard. Shiba chose Isawa, arguably the most powerful Shugenja to have ever lived, to represent the Phoenix Clan. Bayushi chose his lover Shosuro to stand for the Scorpion Clan. Shinjo of the Kirin clan chose Otaku, her most loyal vassal. Doji Konishiko, daughter of the Kami Doji, represented the Crane clan, while Hida Atarasi, eldest son of the Kami Hida, stood for the Crab clan. And so, with his champions chosen, Shinsei led them into the Shadowlands to confront the Mad God. Ultimately, despite their best efforts, Fu Leng could not be destroyed, and so Shinsei and his Seven Thunders had to settle for the next best thing, shattering Fu Leng's essence and imprisoning the fragments within 12 parchments known as the Black Scrolls. The mission was a costly one, however. One does not simply walk into the Shadowlands and expect to come out so easily, after all. In the end, only Shosuro and Shinsei himself managed to return safely with the Black Scrolls. Thus, the war against Fu Leng ended in the 42nd year of the Empire. Hantei immediately ordered that the word be spread across the land that the war was over and that Fu Leng was finally gone. A young servant of Otomo named Miya was chosen for this duty, accompanied by a bodyguard of 5 ronin, or masterless samurai. Miya was swift of foot, and the joyous news spread across the land like wildfire, and the people celebrated. Otomo, being his usual opportunistic self, suggested to Hantei that in return for this great service, Miya should be allowed to found his own family attached to the imperial household. Hantei agreed, and so the Miya family was established. They would serve as imperial couriers for generations to come, and Otomo gained an ally that would forever remain indebted to him and his family. Hantei ruled for another 3 years before dying in the year 45. There are several conflicting stories as to how he died. Some sources claim that he eventually succumbed to wounds suffered during the Battle of Four Winds. Other sources claim that after the final battle against Fu Leng, the so-called Day of Thunder, a demon managed to sneak past the Emperor's guards and injure him fatally with a poisoned claw. Still others say that once the war was over, Hantei decided his task was done and ascended back into the heavens from whence he'd come. Either way, he died and his eldest son, Genji, ascended to the throne as Hantei II, establishing the precedent that from this day forward, all the emperors of Rokugan would be known during their reigns by the name of their family and founder. Genji's younger brother Yamato, perhaps hoping to head off any intrigues and possible succession disputes, stood before the court on the day of his brother's coronation and publicly renounced all claims to the throne. He even went so far as to renounce his own name of Hantei and instead adopted the name of Otomo. This too became precedent, and from that day forward, whenever an emperor or empress ascended to the chrysanthemum throne, their siblings were required to publicly perform the ritual of abdication, renouncing all claims to the throne and being adopted formally into the Otomo family. There would be a total of 39 Hantei emperors over the course of Rokugan's history, a dynasty that would last well over 1,000 years. And that is the story of how the Emerald Empire was founded, and how I discovered this crazy new lore that I really want to talk about. Depending on how well received this is, I might do more videos of this kind. That said, I am going to finish up the story of Oleg Keldroma next week on Star Wars Should This Be Canon before taking the week after that off so I can do my taxes. Until then.